Flying an airplane is one of the most rewarding things that a person can do, but flying an airplane is nothing like driving a car. If you have car trouble, you can just pull off to the side of the road. You can't exactly do that in an airplane. Because of that, there are a few things you should know as a pilot to help you determine if your aircraft is airworthy and safe for flight. Welcome to Free Pilot Training. I'm Josh, and today I'm going to explain everything you need to know as a pilot when it comes to maintenance records and inspections on an airplane. Now, your instructor is going to show you how to do a good pre-flight inspection, but in this video I want to focus on the aircraft logbooks and what you should be looking for. Probably one of the most important things that a pilot can do to keep themselves and their passengers safe is to do a thorough pre-flight inspection on their aircraft. In fact, according to FAR 91.7, the pilot in command of a civil aircraft is responsible for determining whether that aircraft is in condition for safe flight. The pilot in command shall discontinue the flight when unairworthy mechanical, electrical, or structural conditions occur. Because of this, it's important that you learn to do a thorough walk-around inspection of the aircraft before you go fly. But there are a few things that you can't really check during a walk-around. How do I know that the engine is not going to take a dump on me? We all laugh at this, but has the aircraft been maintained or serviced properly? Has anyone looked inside of the wings lately to make sure that the wing spars aren't getting rusty? I mean, that would suck if the wings broke off on me when I was out flying around. But I would never think to take off the wing panel and look in there right before flying. There's just way too much stuff that could go wrong with an airplane. That's why the FAA requires these things to be maintained in a certain way. And this maintenance must be documented properly so we know for sure that this thing is airworthy. Well, who's responsible for making sure that this thing is maintained properly? According to FAR 91.405, each owner or operator of an aircraft has to make sure that all the proper inspections are done on the aircraft. And if there's something wrong, they need to have the aircraft repaired. They must ensure that the maintenance records are documented properly, and those records also indicate that the aircraft can be returned to service. If there's a broken piece of equipment or a broken instrument in the aircraft, there's some stuff that the owner or operator needs to do before it can be used again. Now we're going to go into a lot more detail on this stuff in just a minute, but first I got to know, who is an operator? I know what an owner is, that's pretty obvious, but this thing says that the owner or the operator of an aircraft is primarily responsible for maintaining that aircraft in an airworthy condition. Let's look at the definition of the word operate in Part 1 of the Federal Aviation Regulations. Now I know that a lawyer wrote this definition, but basically it says that operate means to use an aircraft or to cause the use of an aircraft. If you are part of the crew of an aircraft or you're the pilot in command, you are an operator of that aircraft. Either you or the owner or both need to make sure that the aircraft is maintained properly. Both of you share that responsibility.
You know why we a good partnership for us? Because we be watching out for one another, like brothers and stuff.
So, before we can just jump in an airplane and go fly, there are two things we need to do to make sure that it's completely airworthy. First, you need to do a good pre-flight inspection like we just discussed. Second, you need to make sure that the maintenance records are up to date by taking a good look at the aircraft's logbooks. Now, your instructor is going to show you how to do a good pre-flight inspection. But in this video, I want to focus on the aircraft logbooks and what you should be looking for. And the first step in doing that is to make sure that all the inspections are done and that they're documented properly. If you're looking for an easy way to remember all these inspections, a good acronym to use is AVIATE. And no, that's not a typo, the letter I is supposed to be a 1. As you can see, the first inspection we need to be concerned about as pilots is the annual inspection. FAR 91.409 is where you'll find the requirements for this inspection. But the main thing you need to know is that the annual inspection needs to be done every 12 calendar months. That means that if the inspection was done on April 10th, the next inspection is due on April 30th, 12 months from that date. I guess they do this to give you a little time to get that inspection done during the month that it's due. Anyways, if the airplane has not had its annual inspection done in the last 12 calendar months, you cannot legally fly it. But once the inspection has been completed, the mechanic needs to document that properly in the aircraft logbooks, and then you're good to go. Now notice how I said that the inspection needs to be documented properly. This is extremely important, and most A&P mechanics are going to do a good job of documenting their work. But remember, as the operator, you're also responsible to make sure that this is done correctly. So let's take a look at what needs to be written in the logbooks when an inspection's been done. You'll find this information in FAR 91-417. But before I give you the general gist of this document, I want to read the first couple sentences in here. Except for work performed in accordance with 91-411 and 91-413, each registered owner or operator shall keep the following records for the period specified in paragraph B of this section. Records of the maintenance, preventive maintenance, and alteration, and records of the 100-hour, annual, progressive, and other required or approved inspections as appropriate for each aircraft, including the airframe and each engine, rotor, and appliance of the aircraft. Okay, so basically, anytime anyone does anything to the aircraft, engine, prop, or any other part of the airplane, we need to document that in the logbook. I'm going to talk about some of this other stuff here in just a minute, but as you can see, the annual inspection is another time where we need to make sure that the work has been documented properly. So let's look at what this entry in the logbook needs to say in order to be legal. First, there must be a description of the work that was accomplished. If an annual inspection was completed, it needs to say that along with everything that was done to the aircraft. Second, it needs to have the date of completion. So if our annual inspection was done on April 10th, 2023, that needs to be clearly marked in here so anyone who looks at this knows that the next annual is due on April 30th of 2024. Next, the entry needs to have the signature and the certificate number of the person approving the aircraft for return to service. So we need to know who did this inspection and their certificate number because not just anyone can do annual inspections. It has to be a mechanic who holds an IA or inspection authorization. So these are the things we have to have anytime any maintenance is done on the aircraft, including the annual inspection. But we're also required to keep a record of a few things on the aircraft. And the best time to record those things is either during the 100-hour or the annual inspection. So let's take a quick look at those. So, based on my understanding, these things aren't really required during an annual inspection, but a good airplane mechanic is going to include these with his annual or his 100-hour inspection because it's required to be documented regularly in the logbooks. The first thing that's required to be documented is the total time in service on the airframe, engine, propeller, and rotor if it's a helicopter. In addition to that, this also needs to include the current status of the life-limited parts on the airframe and on each engine, every propeller, rotor, and appliance. In other words, if the magnetos are required to be replaced every 500 hours, then you would need to document that in here so we know when to replace those. The next thing that needs to be documented is the time since last overhaul on all items installed on the aircraft, which are required to be overhauled on a specified time basis. Now, a bunch of stuff can fall into this category, but the main thing we're concerned about here is the engine. Every engine is a little bit different, but this Cessna 172H has a Continental 0300 in it, and the manufacturer recommends that you have this engine overhauled every 1800 hours. So, to let us know how long it's been since this thing's been overhauled, you typically see an acronym like this. And this stands for Time Since Overhaul, or this one right here, which stands for Time Since Major Overhaul. There are a few more things you could see in here instead, but these are usually the standard. So if I look in the logbook and see that this thing says 1,820 hours, time since major overhaul, that means this thing is a timed out engine. Now it's important to keep in mind that many of these overhaul periods are manufacturer recommendations, so in most cases you could legally fly the aircraft past overhaul. But if you do this, you really want to know for sure that this engine has been well maintained. I actually discussed this quite a bit in my video with Seth Lake where we talked about 7 things you should know before buying an airplane. So if you want more information on that, you should really check that video out. Anyway, another requirement is that you document the inspection status of the aircraft. This is another reason why a good IA is going to document all this stuff with the annual. All this stuff is required to be documented anyways. You might as well document that at the same time. Okay, the next thing that needs to be documented in here is the current status of the applicable airworthiness directives. Now I'm going to go into a lot more detail on this here in just a minute. But once again, a good IA is going to make sure that the airworthiness directives are all current and up to date, and that they are documented properly when they do the annual inspection. Last but not least, if the airplane has had a major alteration on the airframe, on any current installed engine, propeller, rotor, or appliance, there's some specific forms that need to go into the aircraft logbooks if that happens. Now, this raises an interesting point because the engine, propeller, and appliances can be removed from the airframe and swapped out for other parts, as long as it's done by an approved mechanic. Because of this, most aircraft will have separate logbooks for the airframe, the engine, and the propellers. That allows the mechanic to document all this stuff for each of these items. Then, if you decide to upgrade your engine at a later time, and you sell the old one to another person, then they can have the complete history of that engine. And that makes the engine you're selling much more valuable. Okay, let's take a look at another inspection that's required if you're going to be operating an aircraft for hire. According to 91409B, if you're going to be carrying any person for hire, or if the aircraft is being used for flight instruction for hire, the aircraft needs to have a 100-hour inspection done within the last 100 hours of service. Now, if you're watching this video while you're working on your private pilot's license, this inspection still applies to you if you're receiving flight instruction for hire. If you're getting your flight instruction from your buddy for free in your own personal airplane, then this inspection doesn't apply to you. Now here's something kind of interesting about the 100-hour inspection. Notice here that it says, no person may operate an aircraft carrying any person other than a crew member for hire, and no person may give flight instruction for hire in an aircraft which that person provides, unless within the preceding 100 hours of time in service, the aircraft has received an annual or a 100-hour inspection and been approved for return to service, blah, blah, blah. This means that if an annual inspection has been done in the last 100 hours, the annual inspection can take the place of a 100-hour inspection. However, a 100-hour inspection cannot take the place of an annual inspection. This is because there are a few more things that need to be checked on an annual inspection that is not covered on the 100-hour. I've actually seen some schools that only perform annual inspections, so you never see the 100-hour inspection documented anywhere. In that case, you would just have to look in the logbook at the hours on the aircraft at the time of the annual inspection to know whether or not you're legal for the 100-hour requirement. Okay, so how do I know that my aircraft is due for a 100-hour inspection? Well, first you need to look at the logbook like I just mentioned. Let's say that the company that's renting this airplane to you is doing normal 100-hour inspections, and the last documented inspection was done at 2,252.9 hours. When is a 100-hour inspection due on this aircraft? If you said 2,352.9 hours, I want to congratulate you on your math skills. But which one of these hour gauges do I use? The Hobbs or the takt time? Is this thing due its 100-hour inspection or not? Well, the Hobbs time is used to calculate the time that the aircraft is in use, and that should be used to calculate the time in your logbook. But when it comes to maintenance, you need to use the takt time. In other words, the time you see on the tachometer. So yes, this airplane is due for its 100-hour inspection, and it cannot be operated for hire unless we get that done. Now, 91409 does allow us to go over this time if we absolutely need to. And one reason why we might need to do that is to fly the aircraft to a place where the inspection can be accomplished. Maybe there's no A&P mechanic on the field. In that case, the airplane can be flown up to but no more than 10 hours past the 100-hour inspection time. With that in mind, you can't just go fly around wherever you want for those 10 hours past the 100-hour inspection. They only allow you to go past the 100 hours for the specific purpose of getting the inspection done. And if you do fly past that 100-hour mark, the next 100-hour inspection is due 100 hours from the time the original inspection was due. If you fly 2 hours over, you don't get 2 free hours. So if the inspection was due at 2,352.9 hours and you flew at 2,354.9 hours to get it inspected, the next 100-hour inspection is still due at 2,452.9 hours. I'm sure they do that to keep people from working the system and always going 110 hours before getting the inspection done.
Please, sir, I want some more.
What?
Please, sir, I want some more.
Now, according to FAR 91409, not all aircraft are required to have the annual or the 100-hour inspection. These inspections do not apply to an aircraft that carries a special flight permit, a current experimental certificate, or a light sport or provisional airworthiness certificate. A special flight permit is basically a ferry permit. You can request these from the FAA if you buy an airplane that's out of its annual or 100-hour inspection, and you need to fly it somewhere where you can get that inspection done. Experimental aircraft and light sport aircraft are not required to have the annual or 100-hour inspection done either. An experimental aircraft is basically a kit plane or a homemade aircraft. Someday I'm going to build one of these. Maybe the Vans company will send me an RV-15 to test out on my Adventuremen channel. Anyway, experimental and light sport aircraft have some slightly different maintenance requirements. Instead of an annual, they have to get something called an annual condition inspection. My understanding is that it's not quite as intense, but I really don't know that much about those. But I do know that this condition inspection still has to be documented in the aircraft logbooks. Okay, let's take a look at the next inspection in our AVA acronym, the Altimeter Inspection. You'll find this requirement in FAR 91-411, and what you'll find in here is that no person may operate an airplane or helicopter in controlled airspace under IFR unless within the preceding 24 calendar months each static pressure system, each altimeter instrument, and each automatic pressure altitude reporting system has been tested and inspected and found to comply with these other documents. Now I know that most of you guys watching this video are working on your PPL and you don't even want to think about instrument stuff yet, but this is one of an examiner's favorite questions. When is the altimeter inspection due? And this question comes up because according to 91-205, the altimeter is required for VFR flight, but oddly enough the inspection is not. You only need to have that inspection if you're operating under IFR in controlled airspace. And that inspection is done every 24 calendar months. Now, I'll go into more detail on this when I start working on my instrument series. But as you may have noticed, not only does the altimeter need to be inspected, but so does the whole entire pitot-static system along with each automatic pressure altitude reporting system, if you're going to be operating under IFR. That's all you need to know about the altimeter inspection for now. So let's move on and talk about the T in our AVA acronym, the Transponder Inspection. Now another reason why I mention the altimeter inspection is because that inspection is often performed and documented at the same time as the transponder inspection. And the transponder is also required to be inspected every 24 calendar months. But unlike the altimeter inspection, this is an inspection that concerns you because according to FAR 91-413, you cannot legally use your transponder unless it has had a passing inspection within the last 24 calendar months. Now it doesn't say you can't fly. You just can't use your transponder. Well, what does that mean? That means you cannot fly into certain airspace because you legally need to turn the transponder off according to 91-413. Now, I don't really agree with this reg because I think if you're operating in airspace where the transponder is not required, I believe that it's safer to have that thing turned on. But technically, you're not supposed to use it at all.
Emmanuel, don't do it! Emmanuel, don't do it! Emmanuel!
So, if we haven't had the transponder inspection done, where can we fly? You may remember talking about this in past episodes, but the answer to that is in 91-215. Now things do start to get a little confusing in this reg because there are a few different types of transponders, but the thing to remember is that these things allow ATC to pick you up on radar more easily. So they essentially make the aircraft's radar signature stronger so they can see you better. Now there are two types of transponders that you're allowed to use. The most common type in GA aircraft is the 4096 transponder, but a Mode S transponder works as well. Both of these types of transponders respond to Mode 3A interrogations from ATC. But in addition to that, your transponder also needs to have something called Mode C capability. And all Mode C does is it reports your pressure altitude to ATC. Anyway, if we haven't had the 24 calendar month inspection, that means we cannot use either one of these transponders. Because of that, we can't legally fly in Class A airspace, Class B airspace, the Mode C veil of Class B airspace, Class C airspace. You can't even fly above Class B or C airspace. In fact, you can't fly anywhere above 10,000 feet MSL unless you're flying below 2,500 feet AGL. But as you can see, if you go past the 24-month inspection, this can really limit you on where you can go fly. And if you aren't paying attention to the maintenance records on the airplane, this rule is a really easy one to accidentally break, so keep an eye on that. It's a pretty simple inspection. The mechanic just has to run a few tests to make sure that everything is working the way it should, and the transponder is responding properly to ATC's interrogations.
Where are they?
Now the E in our Aviate acronym stands for the ELT inspection, and I talked about that quite a bit in my last video, but let's take a look at a couple things really quick. The ELT has its own regulation, FAR 91-207, and what you'll find in here is that the ELT needs to be inspected every 12 calendar months. Because of that, the ELT is almost always inspected during the annual inspection. If it's not, make sure you're paying attention to where that's being documented in the aircraft logbooks, because this is another one that's easy to forget. During its annual inspection, the ELT gets checked for a few things. The mechanic checks to make sure that it's installed properly. He checks to make sure that there's no battery corrosion, and he also checks the operation of the controls and the crash sensor, and make sure that it's sending out a good signal. As you may remember, the ELT is a required piece of equipment, and you want to make sure that that thing is working properly in case you ever need it. So making sure that the inspection is done is an important part of making sure that your aircraft is airworthy. Okay, I've had just about enough talking about inspections. Let's move on and talk about everyone's favorite, airworthiness directives. Right now you might be wondering, what the heck's an airworthiness directive? And the easiest way to explain this is that it's kind of like a product recall that sometimes happens to specific parts on an airplane. Now, as they say, every regulation that was ever made was written in blood. And airworthiness directives are so important that they actually get their own regulation over in Part 39. But the main thing you need to know is that the FAA's airworthiness directives are legally enforceable rules that apply to the following products: aircraft, aircraft engines, propellers, and appliances. Now, the FAA issues an airworthiness directive, or AD, on one of these products if they feel that an unsafe condition exists on a specific product on the aircraft and the condition is likely to exist or develop in other products of the same design. Let's take a look at one of the most famous ADs that affect a huge part of the Cessna fleet, including Cessna 172s. The story goes like this. Apparently, some guy was out doing stalls in his Cessna 172, and while he happened to have the nose of the aircraft pitched way up, the little latching mechanism that held the seat in place got worn out. Because of that, the seat slipped off the back of the tracks, and this made the pilot to where he could no longer reach the controls. Apparently when this happened, he lost control of the aircraft, then spun to a fiery death. Well, as you can imagine, this started getting a lot of attention. So what'd the FAA do? That's right, they started looking at these seat rails, and then they realized that these weren't exactly the safest design. And then they created an airworthiness directive to keep this from happening to other aircraft. Once again, these ADs are legally enforceable, and that means that they're mandatory and you have to comply with these and document that they've been done. And just like all the other maintenance on the aircraft, the owner or the operator is responsible to make sure that these have been done and documented in the logbooks. That's why you need to know this stuff, because you're going to be operating an aircraft anytime you go fly it. Now here's an interesting question. When an AD comes out, is the aircraft immediately grounded? It can be in some cases, but in most cases the FAA gives you a little bit of time to get that done. Let's take a closer look at this seat rail AD. Here at the top we have the airworthiness directive number. Then you can see here that this one is effective as of June 17, 2011. Now this AD actually supersedes an older one from 1987. And that's important to know because that original directive no longer applies to our aircraft. Now this thing basically tells us all the different aircraft models that it applies to. And as you can see, this applies to a ton of different Cessna models. Down here we start getting into the meat and potatoes. They give us a brief synopsis of the unsafe condition, then down here it tells us actually what needs to be done. If you take the time to read this thing, you'll notice that this AD is basically an inspection that needs to be done every 100 hours or every 12 calendar months, whichever comes first. And when this requirement first came out, the owner or operator had 100 hours or 12 calendar months to get that first inspection done. So yes, sometimes ADs will require something to be done immediately if the FAA thinks that it's a big enough problem, but usually you have a little bit of time. Now, this particular AD is a reoccurring inspection, and the FAA was nice enough to line it up with the annual inspection. So this AD should be accomplished and documented every annual or 100-hour inspection. But not all ADs are reoccurring, and not all of them are inspections. Some of them require you to change a part one time and that's it. And some require something to be inspected one time and that's it. In that case, this needs to be documented in the aircraft logbooks, so whoever's flying the aircraft can easily access it so they know for sure that this thing's airworthy. Right now I can see that I just scared the crap out of everyone watching this video. And now you might be thinking you don't want to be a pilot anymore. But this isn't quite as bad as you think. If you have a good A&P mechanic, he's going to do most of the legwork on these things. He's going to make sure that they're complied with, and he's also going to make sure that they're documented properly. The hardest part about airworthiness directives is finding out which ones are applicable to your aircraft. And the reason for this is because the airframe is not the only part of an aircraft that can have ADs against it. There can be ADs against the engine, propeller, and basically any appliance installed on the aircraft. No, I'm not talking about a microwave or refrigerator. I'm talking about things like the magnetos, the carburetor, and other stuff like that. So yes, you can go out to your plane and make a list of all the equipment installed on your aircraft, and then you could look up all this stuff in the FAA's dynamic regulatory system, and then check the logbook to see if all these things were done. But a good A&P mechanic has specific software to look all this stuff up. He can also look through the logbook at each one of these ADs to make sure that they've been accomplished, then print out a nice neat document that shows you each airworthiness directive number, what the AD's for, when it was accomplished, how it was complied with, if it's a reoccurring AD, when the next due date is, if it is reoccurring, and who accomplished it. Now, I actually made a video with Seth Lake over at VSL Aviation that goes into a lot more detail on this. So if you want more information on ADs, you should definitely go check that out. But the big thing you need to know is that according to FAR 91-417, one of the records that are required to be with the aircraft is the current status of the applicable ADs. So yes, your A&P buddy could look at each one of these individually and just write the words, all applicable airworthiness directives complied with. But if I see that, I'm not really so sure that they have been accomplished. It's a lot more comforting that my aircraft really isn't in airworthy condition if I can look at something like this and know for sure. Okay, we're done talking about airworthiness directives now. You can uncover your eyes. Let's move on and talk a little bit about alterations and repairs to the aircraft. As you continue to fly, you'll likely run into an issue on your aircraft that requires a repair. You might also find something that you'd like to change or alter on your aircraft. But before you do either one of these things, there's something really important to consider. As you may remember, the aircraft we fly usually needs to be certified in a certain operating category. For example, your training aircraft is likely certified in the normal and possibly even in the utility category. But if you start making alterations or repairs to that aircraft, that can change the way that the airplane flies, and this can cause some serious problems. For example, if you start messing around with the flight controls too much and you make some kind of alteration on those, you could potentially change the center of gravity envelope for your aircraft. Maybe the aft CG limit used to be here, but whatever you did moved it right here. Anyone that's flying the aircraft is trusting this weight and balance chart because the aircraft is certified to fly in this entire envelope. But because you made that change, I could potentially get myself in a dangerous situation if I'm operating back here because I think it's safe. Because of that, when an aircraft is repaired or altered by someone, it needs to be done so by someone who knows what they're doing and is certified to do that work. In addition to that, if there's a major alteration or repair on that aircraft, it must be test flown. Now, 91407 gives you some more specific details on this requirement. But what you'll find here is that 1, the person who does the work needs to be properly certified. Then 2, the aircraft cannot carry any passengers until it's been properly test flown. Oddly enough, this test can be done with someone that has a private pilot certificate. Just be careful about this though. Are you an expert on weight and balance or aircraft performance? Most private pilots are not. This caveat was really made for certified mechanics who know what they're doing and can test the aircraft once they're done with the work. But I guess if you want, you can legally perform the flight test. Just make sure that it's documented properly in the forms and the aircraft is approved for return to service by the mechanic. Here's where we can start getting into the weeds, but I want to mention this because I think it's important for understanding what you can do to your aircraft. The things that you can do to a certified aircraft are very limited. Yes, the mechanic can make minimal alterations to a certified aircraft, but if you want to modify your aircraft in any way, that needs to go through an approval process. This is what we call a supplemental type certificate, or STC. Here's a quick example. This aircraft was originally built with a Lycoming 0320 engine, and this guy's rated for 150 horsepower. Maybe I want a little bit more juice, so I buy an 0360 that has 180 hush puppies. Yes, newer Cessna 172s are often built with the 0360 in them, and they come certified from the factory that way. But if I want to get that installed on my Cessna 172i, I've got to get a supplemental type certificate for that. You might be thinking, why would you need to do that? And the reason is because that aircraft was certified with a smaller engine, and there's a bunch of stuff that's going to change if I get that installed. and all that needs to be added to my POH to make sure that we're operating with the most current and accurate data for flight. With that in mind, you can perform some maintenance on your aircraft as long as it's not major maintenance. You as an owner can only perform preventative maintenance. Part 43 of the Federal Aviation Regulations is where you'll find more details on this. And over in Appendix A, what you'll find is the exact definition of major alterations, major repairs, and preventative maintenance. And down in the preventative maintenance section, the FAA actually tells you all the stuff you can work on yourself, as long as it doesn't involve complex assembly operations. Here's a few things you can do. You can change out or repair the landing gear tires. You can service the wheel bearings on the landing gear. You can refill the hydraulic fluid reservoir. You can do some upholstery work if you're into that, and you can even replace the side windows as long as they don't interfere with the structure of the aircraft or any operating system. Now there's a bunch more stuff in here, but as you can see, these things are really simple maintenance items that keep the aircraft in good operating condition. So once again, you're limited to preventative maintenance, and you can change out some small parts on the aircraft, as long as it's not too complicated. Now the reg that actually allows you to do preventative maintenance is FAR 43.3G. And as you can see, as long as you have a pilot certificate issued under Part 61, both an owner and an operator can do preventative maintenance. But only a certified mechanic can return the aircraft to service if the aircraft is being repaired or serviced for something other than preventative maintenance. But if you do change the oil, or if you do any of these preventative items, don't forget to document that properly in the logbook. Remember, 91.417 says that there's 4 things we need to document when we do that. A description of the work that was done, the date of completion, the signature of who did the work, and the certificate number of the person who approves the aircraft to be returned to service. Remember, even though it's preventative maintenance, it's super important that you document everything you do to the aircraft. That lets everyone know for sure that this thing is in airworthy condition and we don't have anything to worry about. Now, who can return an aircraft to service? According to 43.7, you have to have at least a PPL to be able to return an aircraft to service after performing preventative maintenance. I guess they figure private pilots are responsible enough to remember putting oil back in after they've drained the old stuff and replaced the filter. Okay, but what if I go out to the airplane and I do a pre-flight inspection and something's broken? What now? Can I go fly? Let's say you're getting ready to do the walk around and you turn the master power switch on. What's usually one of the first things you hear when you turn this thing on? Well, you typically hear one of the gyros spin up, don't you? Let's say you turn the master on and you didn't hear anything. Now what? What's broken? Can we legally go fly? Well, as you may remember, most training aircraft with an analog cockpit only have one electrically driven gyroscopic instrument. That's usually the turn and slip indicator. Remember, the attitude and heading indicator are usually vacuum driven. So we've got a problem with the turn and slip indicator. Can we legally go fly? If so, what do we need to do? Well, according to 91.213, no person may take off an aircraft with inoperative instruments or equipment installed unless a few conditions are met. Now, there's a lot of information in this reg, but what you'll find is that there are basically 2 different ways you can determine whether or not you can legally fly without a certain instrument or piece of equipment. First is with an MEL, or minimum equipment list, and the second is by using FAR 91.213D. Now, most of you guys are going to be using FAR 91.213 Section D because MELs are typically for larger turbine-powered aircraft, but there are some smaller multi-engine aircraft that can have them as well. So we'll briefly discuss that here in just a minute. But for now, let's focus on 91.213 because if you have an inoperative piece of equipment, you need to follow this reg to the letter. If you don't, you could fail your check ride if you have something broken and you haven't done any of this stuff. You can even get yourself into trouble after you get your license as well. But anyway, 91.213D says that if we have inoperative equipment, we can still take off if the inoperative instruments and equipment are not part of the VFR Day type certification instruments and equipment prescribed in the applicable airworthiness regulations under which the aircraft was type certified. Remember how I said that we're operating certified aircraft? Well, when the aircraft was certified, there are some pieces of equipment that are often installed on the aircraft that allow them to meet the requirements of a certain category. A good example of this would be a stall fence that you sometimes see on the upper surface of a wing. You can't just take that thing off because you think it looks stupid or you hit a bird and it got damaged. That thing was most likely installed specifically to get that airplane into its certified category. Notice here that this Cessna 172 Sierra POH has something called a comprehensive equipment list. As you can see here, it specifically lists items that are required to meet the FAA certification requirements. It looks like if there's an R next to something, that means the FAA requires it for certification. As you can see, this placard with the operational limits is a required piece of equipment. But if we move down the page and find the turn coordinator on here, that's only a standard piece of equipment, and it's not actually required. Now there are a lot of different ways a manufacturer can list the required equipment on an aircraft. Some of the older aircraft might just have notes throughout the flight manual, and on newer aircraft, you'll often see a list like I just showed you. But something we're starting to see more and more of in newer aircraft is something called a Kinds of Operations Equipment List, or KOEL. If your airplane has one of these, you are required to use it. Now, we're looking at a POH from a newer Cessna 172 Sierra with a G1000 in it. And as you can see, this KOEL is pretty easy to use. All you have to do is find the piece of equipment that's inoperative over here, then find the line that shows the kind of operation that you're going to be flying under. If I'm flying under VFR during the day, as you can see, 0 turn coordinators are required on board the aircraft. If I'm going to be operating VFR at night, then I don't have to have one for that either. But the second I want to operate under IFR, I've got to have at least 1 turn coordinator working. Next, the inoperative equipment cannot be required by FAR 91205. Good old 91205. It keeps coming back up for some reason. It seems like in almost every lesson. I wonder if you're going to see this regulation on your check ride. Okay, so once again, we've got the minimum day VFR required items. Then we have the minimum night VFR required items. Then we have the required IFR stuff. Now, we said that our turn and slip indicator was broken. Is this thing required for day VFR operations? No, it's not. But what if my airspeed indicator was broken? Can I still go fly? No, I can't. As you can see, that's a required piece of equipment. So as of right now, it's looking like we might be able to go fly today. But we've got a few more things to look at and do first.
So you're telling me there's a chance? Yeah!
The last thing we need to do is to check the airworthiness directives. Is this thing required by an airworthiness directive? This is another reason why you need to be familiar with the airworthiness directives on your aircraft. Now there isn't an AD for this particular aircraft for the turn and slip indicator, but take a look at this placard on the fuel selector valve on the Cessna 172H. This is a piece of equipment that is required to be installed by an airworthiness directive, and if you did have an AD that required you to have a turn and slip indicator, then you cannot go fly unless you get that thing fixed. Whew, okay, it looks like the turn and slip indicator is not required, but there's one more thing we got to do. We either need to remove it or deactivate it. The first thing we could do is to remove it from the aircraft. Then we could put a placard on it that says we removed it on purpose, and then we could document it in the logbooks. Another option is to deactivate the item, then put a placard over the top of it that says inoperative. Now, to properly deactivate this thing, all you need to do is pull the circuit breaker for it. If there's not a circuit breaker, it should really be deactivated by an A&P mechanic or a certified avionics guy. And the same thing goes for removing the item. You can't just pull that thing out yourself because it doesn't work. Because you could potentially mess something up, and in some cases the aircraft might need to be reweighed for weight and balance purposes. Once again, don't forget to update your logbook if you do this. Okay, let's talk about MELs or minimum equipment lists for just a minute. Once again, MELs are usually found on turbine-powered aircraft, but some smaller multis can have them as well. The way these work is very similar to the KOEL we talked about earlier, but the FAA has created a basic MEL for most larger aircraft. And if you have an aircraft that needs an MEL, you take that basic MEL, then you look at the specific equipment that's installed on your aircraft, and then you can create a custom minimum equipment list for that specific aircraft. Once that's complete, you have to send that up to the FSDO, or the Flight Standards District Office, and they will either approve it or disapprove it. And once this guy's approved, it's a required item that must be on board the aircraft when it flies. It's like a part of the POH, and that particular MEL needs to stay with that specific aircraft. You can't swap MELs if you have multiple aircraft. Anyway, once this thing is approved, you can use this guy instead of 91213D. But if you do, you have to follow the procedures in there very carefully. This is a page from an MEL for a Beechcraft 400. Let's say my autopilot quit working and I want to go fly to get a $1,000 hamburger. Because let's be realistic, that's what it's going to cost you if you fly this thing. All I need to do is go down this list and find my inoperative piece of equipment on here. As you can see, there's one autopilot installed on this aircraft. Then over here it tells me how many are required. Looks like I don't need no stinking autopilot. But I'm not quite done yet. There's some remarks over here. It says, maybe inoperative provided. It's deactivated. Approach minimums or en route operations do not require its use. The rudder boost is operative. Yeah, you definitely want that in case you lose an engine. Then it looks like I can't go up into RVSM airspace. In addition to that, you probably noticed this little repair category. That just lets you know how long you can use this thing before you have to get it fixed. And there should be a chart somewhere in the MEL that tells you how long you can fly the aircraft before you have to take it somewhere and get that fixed. One last thing I want to mention about the MEL is that if your aircraft has an MEL, you have to use it. You can't just decide that 91-213 is less restrictive, so I'm just going to throw the MEL out the window. Nope, you can't do that. Hey, thanks for joining me today on Free Pilot Training. I know this is a really tough lesson today, but it's also a really important lesson if you want to be 100% sure that your aircraft is safe and 100% airworthy when you take your family out for that $1,000 hamburger. In my next video, I'm going to go into detail on everything you need to know about NOTAMs and the chart supplement. When that video is done, I'll put it right here. See ya!